Good morning.
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 I brought my own water today. Not that I thought anybody was trying to drug me. But I'm one of those people, I like to be sure the flies stay out. So I always put some kind of lid on my drink if I can. Okay. I kept wondering how I'm going to start this, and at the risk of seeming whimsical, did anybody here watch the Kentucky Derby yesterday? Okay, a couple people. I hadn't watched it live in many years, although I follow horse racing. You might not know that about me, but I have loved horse racing since I was a freshman in high school, and I watched the Kentucky Derby on television, and I saw the post parade, and I looked at this one horse and I said, that's my horse. I think that one's going to win. And he did. His name was Dust Commander. I've never forgotten him. And I was hooked from that point on. But I stopped watching a number of years ago for reasons I won't go into because that's a whole other Dharma talk. And but yesterday a friend of mine texted me right before the race went off and said, are you watching? You know, and he said something about the great white, and I'm thinking, there's a shark in the race? So I turned on I had Peacock on my, one of the reasons I don't watch is I haven't had a television for years, but I did have Peacock on my iPad, so I thought, well, let's watch. We'll see if the one that I don't ever watch is running a race, running his horse. And he wasn't, so I was able to keep watching. And a really weird thing happened as they were loading the horses. The great white, the one my friend was talking about, reared up and flipped himself. So he landed on his back. And fortunately, his jockey was very smart. He jumped off and rolled. And it's a good thing he rolled because then the horse rolled and he would have landed all that weight on him. And he didn't. And they both got up and seemed to be fine, but the people who owned the horse, the Great White, scratched him because there was no way to tell that quickly if he was really all right. And they were not about to take the chance. Made sense. So I watched them. They have to, when something like that happens, everything changes. Whatever you thought was going to happen in the race, suddenly it's different. So all the horses that were already loaded had to be unloaded and walked around for a little bit to calm down because they can't be in the gate that long. And they need to sort of stretch their legs a little bit. And so then they reloaded them, and as they were reloading and as they were walking around, I was trying to look at as many of them as I could because that's how you tell how a horse is. And you can tell a lot in a post-parade. I won't go into the finer details of that because, again, that's another whole Dharma talk. But I happened to see this one who was in one of the outer starting gates, and his number was 17, and I thought, oh, that's a really good-looking horse, and he's still bouncy. So I thought, well, if I had to pick one right now, I'd probably pick him. That's the one that won. I laughed when I saw that. I was like, you can't possibly.
You should start doing this for money.
At one point, I did try gambling, and I stopped because it was, my mind was more focused on the money than on the horses, and it's watching the horses that I really love. But I did once do well, anyway, I can't get into that because that'll take too long. But anyway, I did do that, but it wasn't as much fun for me. I enjoy the horses as horses and not as money makers. And they're not money makers for me. So what does that have to do with anything or everything? Well, I mean, we do live in an interconnected world, right? That's what Buddhism's all about. So it must all be connected, and it is. So you're probably wondering, why did I want this strange little altar in the picture? Well, the woman in the picture on the right is Natalie Goldberg. She was a student of Katagiri Roshi, who founded this temple. She's the reason I got involved in Buddhism, because I went to a writing workshop, and she taught us how to meditate in a writing class. And I had tried before. My dog and cat thought it was hilarious, and but I did it because my doctor said, you have a lot of stress, this would probably be good for you. And I thought it was stupid and boring, and until I went to this class, and Nat taught us how to sit. And that was the first time I'd ever had meditation instruction. And we only sat for maybe 2 minutes. But in those 2 minutes, I remember thinking, this is meditation? I can do this. And it opened up a completely new world. So yesterday we had what I called I called it a writing practice sesshin. Nat calls it the True Secret Retreat, or True Secret Sesshin, which is short for the true secret of writing. I don't know if I gave any true secrets to anybody yesterday, but she teaches writing practice as a Zen practice. It's timed, and it comes with a prompt, and you write for that period of time, like we sit a period of Zazen. And it is a way of studying your mind, like Zazen is. In Zazen you sit and you notice what comes up, because thoughts come up. I mean, actually, she's the first person I ever heard say, we talk about the heart and the lungs as involuntary muscles, but she said the mind is an involuntary muscle too. It's constantly creating thoughts. We don't get a choice. Thoughts come up. And a lot of people think meditation is meant to suppress the thoughts. It's not. You're allowed to have them. You just notice them. You don't hold on to them. You don't, grab them and hold on. And, especially when I think a lot of us, I can speak for myself. I can't speak for you. I have often held on to grief, anger, disappointment, and sat through many a period of Zazen, crying my way through because of my feelings about something, holding on to it. Just telling myself the same stupid stories in my head because I didn't know what else to do. And one of the things that I learned as I practiced was you tell yourself the same story enough times and you really get sick of it. And you kind of get sick of yourself. You're just like, enough already, stop. But you don't ever stop thinking. You just stop holding on to those things that make you miserable, or you stop elaborating on the story so that you can make it, look better for you, even if it's only to yourself, and you're not going to share this with anybody else anyway, but you want to look good to yourself. I mean, it's kind of important, self-esteem. And if you think I'm being sarcastic, yes, I am. So writing practice for me was a way to, it was an entry into Zen practice, but it was also a way to experience Zen practice. And when I was early in my practice, people would teach things. They'd reference teachers. I mean, Katagiri was one of them, of course. Nat was able to talk about him in ways that were really easy to understand. But I tried reading his book, Returning to Silence, when I first started to practice. That was my first Dharma book. Not exactly a beginner's book. I would pick it up to read, and within 10 minutes I was asleep. And that's how I read it, in 10-minute chunks. As long as I could stay awake, I read. When I fell asleep, I never moved the bookmark because I knew I was going to fall asleep. So I wanted to know where I was, since I didn't understand any of it, so I'd never remember otherwise. And eventually I did get through the whole book, like in about 6 months. And I probably understood one thing in the entire book. And that is something I found very endearing, because of course English was not his first language. And the people who edited his talks for him into this book did a really great job, but they did leave some of his ways of phrasing things in there. And one of them it was the one thing I understood. He'd talk about something and I wouldn't understand what he was talking about. And then at the end of it, he'd say, and that's pretty good. And I was like, oh, okay, I know what that means. And it was like a kind hand on the shoulder or a pat on the back. And it made me feel that my effort meant something. And it was as much an entry as the writing practice and the 2 minutes of meditation. And then I got to San Francisco Zen Center, hardcore. And it was. I'd started off in a small center in Pittsburgh, and it was great because, there was a small group and we got to know each other, and, Kyoki, who was here, was the teacher, and, she was very gung-ho. It was her first place on her own, and that was all wonderful and inspiring and great. And then I got to San Francisco, and they were so grim. I was like, what is with these people? Don't they have fun? Don't they enjoy the Dharma? And I'm sure they thought, who is this clown who smiles all the way through service? Like I'm having fun, which I kind of was. And there, they do 9 bows at the beginning of service. So, the 3 bows that you do, they do 9 on normal mornings at like 6 in the morning. And it took me a while to get used to that. Aside from the effort, I wasn't the most balanced or coordinated person. And one day I wasn't quite paying attention, and the person in front of me kind of stepped back a little faster than I thought they would. And so trying to compensate and still get my bow down, I rolled. I almost took out a whole row. I didn't. And I did hear a few snickers, and, I couldn't blame them. I was kind of laughing too. But anyway, so they took it all very seriously. And needless to say, we heard a lot about Dogen. If you don't know who Dogen is like our great, many great-grandfathers. All the way back to the 12th century, he brought Buddhism from China to Japan. He was Japanese. He went to China to learn about it, got in a boat, came back, brought it with him. And he had many teachings. A lot of them really practical. His Tenzo Kyokun is great. It's all about the kitchen, putting big heavy things on the bottom, light small things on the top. That's pretty practical. You can get behind a Zen practitioner like that. But he also said a lot of things that made my head hurt. And one of the things that kept coming up again and again and again was this: to study the Buddha way is to study the self. Okay, I kind of got that part, you know. Meditation is study of the self, study the mind. To study the self is to forget the self. Okay, he lost me there. To forget the self is to be actualized or awakened by the myriad things, or the 10,000 things. And then I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Some of you may understand that easily. I had a very stubborn mind, and I did not. I think because at that point I still was pretty sure I was the center of the universe. And everything happened through me. If I didn't see it, it wasn't real. And if anything was wrong with the people around me, it was my fault. I was responsible. And I'm being a little overly dramatic, but I'm not being inaccurate. I really did think everything was about me. It's a little embarrassing to admit that, because I was in my 40s at the time. I mean, you'd think I would have learned something by then, and I did, but I didn't learn that. I didn't learn that everything wasn't about me. That if the people I cared about were having a difficult time, it wasn't necessarily anything to do with me. Sometimes it was, especially if it was my mother. There was usually something I did that irritated the hell out of her, but, you know, not everybody. It took me time to realize that forgetting the self doesn't mean you don't care about yourself. It just means that you're involved in the world. You're involved in the myriad things around you, the myriad people around you, nature around you. You're just not completely focused on you. Everything doesn't revolve around you. And when you are able to do that, and it took me time, you start to notice other things. There's a sort of corollary to that. If you don't understand what Dogen is saying, when you get to the part about to study the way is to forget yourself, to study yourself is to forget yourself. If you don't forget yourself, you still notice all the people, all the things, all the stuff in the world around you. But you think it's your noticing that makes them real, instead of them being real in and of themselves, independent of you, but not independent of you, because we are all interconnected. Of course, these are the things that made my head hurt too, to kind of work it through to that point and say, no, that doesn't make sense. But it does, because we can both notice things and allow them to touch us in some way that is not about our power or our reality, but about being in the same reality together. So why did this all come up for me? It wasn't really the Kentucky Derby that started this. I had this all in mind before the Kentucky Derby. A couple weeks ago, I was listening to David Whyte, the poet, and it's White, W-H-Y-T-E, if you ever want to look him up. And I was listening to an audiobook he had recorded, and it was on his, it was his book, The Three Marriages. And he was talking in that book about Dogen and about that quote. And he read a poem that he'd written that was inspired by Dogen, called Everything is Waiting for You. And when I was listening to that, I went, wait, what? Now, I read this book several times. I mean, my copy is all marked up with notes and highlighting and everything. And I listened to it on the audiobook at least a couple of times. And I had never picked up that it was inspired by Dogen and this quote. How did I miss it? Because I was reading with an agenda. I was listening with an agenda. I had an idea about what I wanted from this book. And I wasn't allowing it to awaken me. I was going down my path to what I wanted from it. That's the difference. This time, I didn't have a plan. I was just listening. And suddenly I heard it. There's a connection here. Huh. And I looked at the poem again. I listened to him read it again. I remembered reading it when I was in the kitchen at San Francisco Zen Center and I was Tenzo. Because it had a reality there. He was talking about the pots and the pans and the tea kettle, and you know, there we were in the middle of all that. And I was like, how did you miss this? How did you miss this all this time? But I did. Because I was focused on me. I didn't forget me. Not for a second. Until suddenly, I forgot. And then his poem woke me up. Not just to the myriad things in the kitchen, but to its connection with this teaching that I could have made a dozen times, but I didn't until that moment. And it then reminded me of a poem by Pablo Neruda in his book, Ode to Common Things. It's actually just called Ode to Things, that particular poem. But every poem in the book is an ode to common things in our lives. And I remember Tia reading the particular poem in a Dharma talk and being struck by things that he talked about, like hats and eyeglasses and how wonderful they were and what joy they brought him. And he wasn't talking about Dogen or Zen, but he was. He just didn't know it. And it made me wonder, as I thought about these things or as they came up, how many things I've missed at times because I was focused on a particular direction I wanted to go or something specific I wanted to learn. And I didn't let myself go enough to learn what was in front of me. So one of the reasons this altar is here is because yesterday was, it was nothing but letting go of what my plan was for the day and just following what happened and letting it evolve because of the particular people who were there and their response to the moments that we were sharing and the various cats who came to visit us throughout the day and everything that came up sent us in a direction that I wasn't planning. I mean, I had a list of prompts I was going to use, and at one point I was like, oh no, I cannot use those. Way too dark, you know. We don't have enough time for that kind of darkness. Because we didn't. I was remembering what it was like to use them in a 5-day retreat on the 4th day. And I was going to do it in one afternoon? I don't think so. Because people are different. They don't respond to just you plopping something down and saying, this is what we're going to do, when you don't have the time to absorb it properly. And you haven't had the preparation time to move into it gently. It would have been like hitting everybody on the head with a sledgehammer in the middle of the afternoon. and then saying an hour later, okay, go home. And a couple of the people are here today, so, you know, they know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't do that to people. And you don't do it to yourself. I mean, I can only imagine what that would have felt like for me to know that I sledgehammered people in a workshop and a sesshin, and they went home with that. I mean, once I did do it, not in a sesshin. It worked out okay, but we were in the middle of I think it was a 10-day retreat. And it was a writing retreat. We called it a writing retreat, but it wasn't, we didn't meditate or anything. It was strictly writing, you know, classes. Anyway, I would always show a video, and then we would talk through the elements of, you know, plot list. And it used to be the person who taught it originally did it with a full-length movie. And I learned to go shorter because people would skip out on the movie if they'd seen it, because they figured they would know what we were doing and they would miss a lot. So anyway, I would use something like an episode of West Wing, which was 45 minutes, and usually moved fast enough to keep everybody there. So I picked an episode of West Wing, and it was, you know, I was like, this is a great episode because you have this stuff happening with this African nation and, you know, drug companies, because there's, you know, this problem with getting drugs for people who have AIDS in Africa. And then there's this Republican lawyer who beat the hell out of Sam on Capitol Beat, which is like a Sunday morning news show, like Meet the Press, and you know, they want her to come and work at the White House, and what are they doing? And, you know, all kinds of great conflicts. Aaron Sorkin wrote it, so it was great dialogue, really brilliant story. I forgot about the end. It was funny, it was dramatic, it was exciting, and you came to really respect the leader of the African nation who was there talking to the drug companies. And then there was a revolution in his country. And his wife and daughters got out safely, and his sons were executed. And he heard that, and he said, I have to go back. And they said, you can't go back. They'll kill you as soon as you get there. And he said, no, I have to go back. I have to try. And he went back, and he was executed as soon as he got off the plane. And that was the end. And I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? Because I could see there was no sound. The music of West Wing is playing, and the credits are rolling, and there's dead silence, and nobody was even moving. I'm like, oh God, what have I done? So, I mean, I had to say something, you know, and I did. I apologized. I said, I am so sorry. I said, I thought about how great this was and how well it was written. I didn't think about the impact of that last scene. I'm really, really sorry I did that to you. And when they could talk, which was a few minutes, they said, don't apologize. You know, it was really great. We just weren't expecting that ending, but it was really brilliant, and, you know, we're really glad we saw it. Now, that's a bunch of writers. But I will say I did learn from that. You can't just assume that you know everything about how people will respond. And take that a step further, you can't assume that you know how you'll respond. Which is kind of what Dogen was trying to say, is let yourself be awakened. Let yourself see what knocks you out and what doesn't. What wakes you up and what puts you to sleep. And you have a choice You have a choice. You don't have to be open to it. You don't have to be willing to wake up. But once you cross that line and let yourself be awakened even a little, as Katagiri would say, it's too late then. Because you can't unsee what you've seen. You can't understand what you've understood. It doesn't mean that you've learned everything in a minute, but in a way you have. Because in that minute of Zazen that I had with Natalie Goldberg, my life changed. There have been a number of times that I have been able to get out of my own way and be awakened by things, just for a moment, just to remind myself I live in a world that has a lot of possibilities if I'm open to them. And I can still be pretty stubborn and try to keep the doors closed. But when I don't, when I open the doors, when I let myself, incredible gift of other people, other beings, other cats, many things. And I think there's, I feel a lot of gratitude for that. And I will say there was one other mention of Dogen this week on Substack, of all places. And that was kind of the final thing. I just said, you know, you got to talk about this. Because the last talk I gave 2 weeks ago, I'd heard the David White thing, and I was like, no. I'm not talking about Dogen. But I guess I am. Because I guess my agenda was, didn't have to happen then, but it had to happen. Dogen and I have kind of an interesting relationship. I'm not fond of a lot of what he says, and some of it blows me away. Mostly the Tenzo Kyokun, because I spend a lot of time in the kitchen. And we're all different. So what wakes me up may not wake you up, or may not inspire you to let go enough to be awakened. I can only share my own experience of reading Katagiri, reading Dogen, listening to Nat, being around you, being around the cats. We all experience our life differently. And it feels sometimes incredibly lonely. But we're not alone. If we can remember that everybody else is also experiencing things, they may be different from our things, but they're experiencing things too. And why not talk about it? Why not share it? Why not just be present for each other and sit together in a little library and write together and just be. We should be so lucky. So I'm going to end it there.